Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and those who dream of writing, and for everyone who wants to know the story behind the book. And today I have a very special guest, the author of over 50 books, including the international #1 best-selling American Sniper, and 15 other best-selling books that have been on the New York Times list. Whoa, that's a big and impressive number. And I'm so happy to welcome Jim DeFelice to the program. He has been on my radio program many times, and he is known for his historical works and the deep research that he puts into his books, including a wonderful book that we're going to have a special program about, West Like Lightning. The book that we're talking about today, of course, as it is the 80th anniversary of D-Day, we're talking about Omar Bradley, General at War, and I am so happy to welcome Jim to the program. Hi, Jim.
Hi, with an intro like that, I'm not sure if my head is going to be able to fit through the door on the way out, but thank you very much for your kind words.
You are so impressive, and of course, when I talked to you before about this book, Omar Bradley has a special significance to me because my dad was in D-Day, and he was also under Omar Bradley command, and he, like all the GIs, they loved him. It's so exciting that I can talk to somebody who knows a lot about him. And then there was another book that you did, and so I wanted to show both books. You also did a memoir of D-Day, Every Man a Hero. So why don't you just explain about these two books and why you wrote them, and then we'll get into talking about them.
Sure, I'd love to. Omar Bradley, the funny thing about Omar Bradley is I have to give a little bit of credit to my agent at the time, Jake Elwell. He and I were having lunch. We were talking about just different things. He's a bit of a history buff as well, and I was searching for something important to do. He mentioned nobody has done a biography of Omar Bradley, and I couldn't believe that. But it turned out to be true. No one had at the time done a full book devoted solely to Omar Bradley. I think part of the reason for that may have been that Bradley's own memoir of the war was just very good. But for some reason, Bradley had fallen out of favor among historians. He was not anywhere near as colorful as George Patton, whom he served under and then commanded later on. But one thing led to another as I started digging into it, and I decided, probably foolishly, at least from a business point of view, that I was going to write a biography on Omar Bradley. And unfortunately, years of research later, I came out with the book.
And of course, we'll talk a little bit about Every Man a Hero because that's also a great book, and it takes us right back to Omar Bradley. For many people, when they think of D-Day, they don't think of Omar Bradley. Only
Sure.
like all the children and grandchildren of the guys who were at Normandy, they think of Omar Bradley. Most of the people will think Dwight D. Eisenhower. As a matter of fact, somebody once said to me, D-Day was named for Dwight D. Eisenhower.
I apologize
Oh,
for
that's
that.
all right. Of course, the thing with Bradley, he wasn't a camera hog. He didn't run to every camera, jump there, and start talking. He was going to the troops and talking to the troops.
Oh, absolutely. Bradley preferred to a fault, really, to stay in the background. He was not especially fond of journalists, to be honest. The one exception he made was Ernie Pyle, who did a wonderful article on him by spending days with him in Sicily. But Bradley was much happier to be out talking with his troops. As a matter of fact, we mentioned Ray Lambert. Ray had been a medic, or was a medic in the Army, and served under Bradley, was involved in all of the American invasions, seaborne invasions in the European theater up until D-Day, where Ray actually saved at least dozens of men and then wounded himself. Ray, as a medic, would often be found at the front lines on the closest aid stations to the combat, and Bradley often visited him there. Maybe we get into a little story about, as we go on, a little story about Ray's take on Omar Bradley.
Let's go back a little bit and talk about his life. Of course, he was born in Missouri, which was a great influence on him. We had a lot of very famous people coming from Missouri. And he was born, of course, on Abraham Lincoln's birthday, which is very interesting, on February 12th. And that was back in 1893.
Yeah, Omar was a really just down to earth country boy. His dad was, when Bradley was born, they lived in a very small house. I believe there was maybe 3 rooms, stretching a little bit of the definition of rooms. It was very close to his dad. His dad was a school teacher at a 1-room schoolhouse back in those days, and they would walk to school together. And it was a very good relationship. But then, unfortunately, his father died unexpectedly even before Ray was a teenager. And so the family, not that they were exactly rolling in dough at the time, but things became very much harder for his mom. They moved to a slightly larger or somewhat larger city. And so Omar, as a young man, had to not only go to school, but also work where he could. I think a lot of those experiences as a young man, having to make his way, really did help to inform his adulthood.
One of the things I've always liked about him, among many things, is that he became a math teacher, teaching mathematics eventually at West Point. For somebody like me, I do quadratic equations for fun. Like when I,
Oh my goodness.
that's
Oh
what I
my
do.
goodness. Oh,
Instead of crossword puzzles, I
was
love to do quadratic equations. So I always
yeah.
think of him. I know that he loved math, and as I said, he became a math teacher, but he had a little struggle at one point with math, and I can understand it because I too, I remember at a calculus exam once, I looked at it and I said, "What is that?" I couldn't remember anything suddenly. And he had that kind of experience, and it was for something very important. So tell us about that.
It was, and I have to say that you and Bradley would have gotten along very well because actually there's good evidence of this that he would oftentimes in being transported by plane back and forth, you want to take your mind off of things, and maybe some of us might read or tell others jokes. Bradley would do math problems. That's how he would unwind in those few minutes as he flew hither and thither. But he was very good at math from a young age. And as things happened, as he was getting older, still a teenager, and he was working for a railroad. And he was talking one day to the director there, who's asked him, young man, what would you like to do when you grow up? And Bradley said that he was saving up money to go to college, but college was very expensive. And it was suggested to Bradley that, if you go to West Point, that's a really good school. And Bradley said, oh, and he was very interested, except he said, that's going to cost a lot of money, and I don't really have the money. And the response was laughter, and then, no, they actually pay you. And Bradley was all in on that. Now, even in those days, you needed to get an appointment to West Point, which is obviously the Army Academy. And in order to even be considered, you had to do well on a test. And in those days, or in this case anyway, it was a 2-day test. So Bradley had saved up his money to pay for the train fare and goes there, and he's ready. And math had always been his best subject. He nails everything else, and then he comes to the math section of the test, and his mind completely blanked. He couldn't. You're talking about quadratic equations, and later on he's doing binomial equations. But in this, I think the very first thing was very simple algebra, and he could not, for the life of him, add 2 and 2,
I know
and he
the
was going to
feeling.
give up. He was going to definitely give up, and he almost walked out. But he felt he'd be embarrassed to leave so early, so he fiddled around and he looked down. paper, and as he was looking down, he saw something, and oh, I can do that one, and then I can do that one, and then lo and behold, he finished the entire test, and the rest kind of is history. He did very well on the exam and went to West Point.
There's something else that why we would get along. I love baseball. And
Ah,
the only D, well, I always got A's, but the only D I got was because I wouldn't play baseball the way they wanted me to. I would pitch a regular baseball pitch, not that girl pitch overhand stuff. I hated that. And the teacher, and it was like fifth grade, and she got so mad at me. She said, "You can't pitch like that. That's how boys pitch." I said, I'm pitching that way. And so I got a D. I saved that report card because it is the only D I ever got.
she may have cut off a career. You could have been the first major league pitcher.
Yeah, that's
I'm
what I wanted
sure.
to be. That's what I wanted to be. And
Oh
here's a
goodness.
picture of him. He's second from the left, and this is the West Point baseball team of 1914. I just discovered that every member of that team who stayed in the Army became a general.
That's a remarkable class. They call that class the class that the stars fell on. And I forget exactly the numbers,
I've
but
got it right here.
oh,
59.
you thank you.
Yeah.
59 out of the 164. Bradley was 40, 41, 44, somewhere in there. So he was top third of the class. But it's just a remarkable class. That's the same class, of course, that as you have on the screen here, that Eisenhower was in, and they were friends. But yeah, it's just an all-star class. Part of that is circumstances, but I think the other part is just the great education they got, and of course the quality of the individuals who were chosen. But we're talking about baseball, and let me mention that Bradley also had a very good arm, although he did not pitch. It's said that he could throw many runners out from left field, or whatever outfield he was playing at the time. He loved baseball. He later, as an officer, coached a team. I've always thought, and of course I don't know how you prove this, but I've always thought that the experience of playing on the team and maybe managing it a bit and working with some of the younger players and the different personalities that you find, I think that was good practice for him later on as he worked his way through the ranks of the Army, and then especially when he was a general at D-Day and after the invasion at Normandy.
Yeah. Thinking about that, let's look at the headlines, and then I want you to lay the groundwork for what was happening just before this. Because here is D Day, June 6th, 1944. And of course, the invasion. I want you to lay the groundwork. What was happening just before that? Tell us where he was situated, Eisenhower was situated. Um, there were some delays in the invasion. So tell us a little bit about what was happening in England at that time.
Of course, all the command staff and the planners were back in England and London, South England, and really all over Great Britain working. It's a remarkable to think of. There were, I think it's about 160,000 men actually hit the beaches, but beyond that, there's another almost 200,000 men, almost entirely men, on the ships. And then back on shore, you have thousands and thousands of people who are doing all sorts of things, from loading boats to working at the hospitals. It's a massive effort that had taken, it was years in the making, but it took months and months of real planning. Bradley, at right before the invasion, boards a ship, and that becomes his command station as the invasion progresses. Now, you can see from that photo, there's a lot of heavy clouds in the distance. And believe it or not, that photo was taken during the good weather, or the good part of the weather that day. It had been rainy and stormy for days. And really, June 6th was basically their last shot at it for a month or maybe even more, because you would have had to reorganize everything. Maybe would you have lost, would it still have been a secret, and everything going on. And Eisenhower finally had that very difficult call of trying to listen. It's not the best conditions, but we're going to try it anyway. Bradley, by that point, of course, is at sea, and he is getting reports as first the paratroopers land in the middle of the night. Um, we then have the successive waves of Allied troops landing. For the Americans, there are two beaches. There's Omaha, and then Utah. Omaha was always the most problematic beach. In the very, very original planning, the invasion was going to take place on those beaches to your right. Those are the British beaches, primarily British and Canadian troops on Gold, Juno, and Sword. And their goal really was Caen, which we see under the blobs of the invasion. And the idea there was that they would take Caen, and then the Allies would then sweep across the plain to Germany, taking a hard left from their perspective. Meanwhile, the Americans would land on what came to be called Utah. They would cut off that peninsula. At the very head of that peninsula, Cherbourg is a major port, and if everything was going well, they would use Cherbourg to bring supplies in and that sort of thing. But at some point in the planning, it was recognized that if you had two very distinct beachheads like that, you would be both would be very vulnerable, especially the British, where they would be very exposed. So you really had to link those beaches, and you wanted to link those beaches as early as possible. And that is how Omaha comes to be one of the American focuses. And as it turns out, it's the most difficult beach on the initial invasion. We suffer the most losses there. And it was always very problematic. And it was the beach that gave Bradley, at least, the most concern,
Now,
especially on D-Day.
why were they named?
Okay. That is a great question. And a lot of things in history. I'm going to tell you a great story. There's a great story about it. How much proof there is, I can't swear to. It sounds very plausible, but as far as I know, nobody has actually been able to totally dig up the facts. And personally, I'd love to hear them, but as anyone would guess, you can't just call the beach by the French name of the beach or of the town nearby, because obviously that's going to tip off the Germans if they happen to overhear it somehow or see a message. So you need code names. The story goes that Bradley was working around his headquarters, or wandering around his headquarters as he was wont to do, and started chatting up a couple of privates. Perhaps they were constructing something. One of the versions of the story is that they were carpenters, and there are always privates in the story, which kind of is fitting with Omar Bradley, so he did like to talk to the enlisted men around him. One of them, as he was speaking, mentioned that he was from Utah, Provo, in most versions of the story, by the way. And of course, the other one that he talked to was from Omaha, Nebraska. And as the story goes, one thing leads to another. It happens to be kismet that day. They needed code names, and Bradley drew those names out of his memory, and the rest, as we say quite a lot, was history. I think those are great stories. If you made me swear on a stack of Bible that they're true,
I don't
I'd
know.
probably
I
cross
love it.
my fingers.
No,
I'd cross my fingers, to be honest.
no, I think it would have been. It's great. It's a great idea, and it probably is true, because that's the kind of thing he might do. I just wish he'd talk to my dad, and then the beach would be named after my hometown. That would have been really cool. When you think of it, as you were mentioning, the weather was bad, and they had already canceled. I don't know how many times. And there were so many. When you were doing your research, did you look into all of the sort of the camouflage things that they were doing on land, trying to hide the bases, and also the all the things that they were doing to keep it secret that they had massed all these people and were ready, you know, to load them onto boats and send them across the channel? Which, by the way, I was one time on, I've crossed the channel many times on a boat, but I was one time on a boat and it was so bad. The weather was so choppy. Like, oh. And I was thinking about my dad at that point.
I've taken that crossing myself. June, the summer months are better than in the fall and winter, but I can't imagine being in a I can't imagine being on a ship and then having to climb down to a landing craft, let alone going across in slightly larger landing craft. Obviously, these guys were very brave, but the whole one of the big reasons that D-Day was become so successful, besides all the effort that was put in, and obviously the courage of the men, mostly men who were involved, was that the Allies managed to keep it a secret, and they kept the Germans guessing to the very end. And when the invasion starts, the Germans do not at first, most of the Germans don't really believe that it's the main thing. And part of the success actually had to do with General Patton, who was not involved in D-Day, but was heading a kind of a shadow force, and there was an entire army of a fake army in another part of Britain that was a part of an elaborate deception. There was quite an operation. That's the subject of several books, actually, just to keep the Germans off guard. The other thing is that if you're a military person and you're looking to invade France, Normandy is not today. Oh, obviously, that's the obvious place to go in. But the reality is, and certainly at the time, given the technology and everything else, it was not the best or most ideal place, not so much to land, but then to fight a campaign afterwards. But all the preparation work and everything else did certainly play a role in helping the Allies to eventually break out and succeed.
Because the Germans were, where were all of their troops at that time? The majority of their troops stationed at that time.
They are scattered around. Scattered isn't. They're concentrated in different spots in France, and obviously they do have troops on the front line, but they're also planning to be able to reinforce when they do find that there's an invasion. They knew something was going to happen. Obviously, they plan to reinforce things. Had the command come for a Panzer unit, an armored unit of the Germans, to come and smash the American attack, say, although there were plans on dealing with that the outcome might have been different, but that decision was delayed just enough to help the Allies get a foothold.
So, were the Germans completely taken by surprise that day, or not?
I would say that in terms of strategically, they were not. They were definitely tactically surprised. They did not know. They looking at the weather. We'll put it this way: looking at the weather, they did not think that anybody would be foolish enough to invade. And Mole, who's the key commander, is away from the front. So there's definitely that surprise. They were surprised that was the main effort. I think early the early German thinking was that this is just a fake. They're going to land somewhere else. And by the time they actually realized what was going on, the invasion was well underway. Now, that's not to, I'm sure that some individual German units they were maybe surprised for 13 seconds, and then they started firing back.
And
And
they
the
fired,
Germans,
and they fired.
and they fired, and they were also very brave. Obviously, they were the enemy, but they were eventually overwhelmed. I see that you're putting up the totals of
Yeah.
the number of Americans who are dead, as well as just that's the accepted 4414 is the accepted number now for how many Allied troops died, as it says. The interesting thing for me, we've now settled on the 2,501 number of Americans killed that day, or I think it's actually a 24-hour period. But the initial reports from the Army listed only about 1,500, actually a little less, killed on the first day. And that's the first, that shows you just how confusing the reports were at first. They had another 2,000 men that were unaccounted for. Not that were wounded, but that they didn't know, were they missing, were they taken prisoner, were they dead, that the system had not quite caught up to them. And one of those people who was missing, and it would turn out that many of them, as you can see from the statistics, that many of them did turn out to be dead. But one of the people who was missing, on paper anyway, because he knew where he was the medic Ray Lambert, who had been wounded on the beach and found himself on actually a large landing craft is made primarily for transporting tanks, on his way back to Britain for hospital care for his wounds. There was a lot of men. They had there was a tremendous organization involved. They had everything we're talking about. I'm talking about wounded here. They would come in, they would be triaged, they would be sent for a certain amount of treatment, and then they might be sent on to a hospital or someplace else that's appropriate. It's just massive operation. But even with all of that and all of that planning, in the chaos of war, in the first few hours, you can't always keep track of everything. Eventually, it catches up to you.
Speaking about Ray Lambert, so you wrote the Omar Bradley book, and how long did that take you? How the research and how much time and years or hours,
Um,
days?
it was long enough that I can't, off the top of my head, answer. We're talking years. To be honest, that became more a passion project where I just kept at it. I have to credit my wife, Deborah, she was my primary researcher on that book, and she just spent countless hours just helping, digging out information, arranging some interviews, and just you can imagine the boxes and boxes of data and copies of data that we had to amass. The book itself, when we found a publisher, I had to narrow it down and just focus on the war. And it's amazing to me how full Omar Bradley's life really was. And, we can only just touch on things in a sense. And it's humbling to see how much he was able to achieve over the stretch of his lifetime.
And of course, he was one of the five-star generals that we've had. So, uh,
He's he was our last. Will he, or he's our most recent, should be the way I should say that. I don't know. I hope that the circumstances are such that we don't need another
need
5-star general.
exactly.
So I hope that he is our last. But that's pretty incredible. When you reach that rank, they don't let you retire. Really, he would, after he became chief of staff. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the first person to hold that job after the Army reorganized following World War II. And we would say he retired, but of course the Army wouldn't really let him retire. Nobody, I don't think, expected him to go visit troops at the front, although he did visit some in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. But they did want to be able to call on his expertise and his experience. And I think as he always had a bit of a sense of humor, and I think it became droller and droller or at least the stories seemed droller and droller as he aged. He was reputed to be, by eyewitnesses, very good company, especially in the afternoon when I think it was the martinis might flow. I don't know how much he was drinking, but
I think there are a couple of times in his life when he needed a stiff drink, including there's so much, as you said, there's so much that he did. We're talking also before D-Day about North Africa and about Sicily and about all of these things that he was right there. And maybe let's take a little time to talk about a little bit of that too.
Okay, let me tell you about this. Since you're mentioning drink, I want to tell you one story that Ray Lambert told me. And Ray had been, Ray was in the Torch landings, which were the American landings in Africa. He was on Sicily, same, which was actually very hellacious for where Ray was. And then he was obviously on Normandy, which was even worse. And Ray, as a medic, would treat the wounded. And to do that, of course, the medics are very close to the front line and they have stations close. Bradley was what was known as a corps commander in Africa and in Sicily, where a corps commander, in general terms, would be in charge of 2 or more divisions and some attached units. And Bradley would visit pretty much every day, would visit some component of his troops. That often brought him to the front lines, and it often brought him to the aid stations. Now, according to Ray, and I have no reason not to believe this is true, the medics medics were very, as everybody in the army, but certainly the medics, who did tend to be NCOs, they were very inventive, like your typical NCO. When they saw that they had some kind of powdered orange juice and they had some alcohol, and lo and behold, some enterprising soul mixed the two and came up with a very spicy, perhaps alcoholic drink. Whether that was allowed by regulations or not, I'm not really sure. I don't ask those questions. But apparently, they would often offer it to visitors to the front lines. And according to Ray, Omar Bradley was one of the partakers. And he especially liked that orange juice that he could find at the aid station. That's contrary, by the way, to some of the reports. Bradley was not given he certainly was not someone that overdrank. But he wasn't quite a teetotaler. Certainly at the time, drinking was a lot more common and very much more accepted. He did not fall into that category, but he did make sure to keep a bottle of whiskey in his office and often offered it to visitors. Going back, Bradley was sent originally to Africa as a fact finder for General Marshall. He had worked under Marshall for quite a while, had known Marshall, and at the time was hoping to be assigned. This is after Pearl Harbor, and he was hoping to be assigned to lead a unit over probably into the Asian theater, the Pacific theater. Among other things, he had trained up the 82nd Infantry Division, which was selected to become, it had done such a good job there that it was selected to become our first paratrooper unit in the war. And it's a huge honor, a lot of work for them, and of course a lot of danger, but that's just one indication of how good he was. But he was a bit disappointed. Things were not going very well for the Americans in Africa. As a matter of fact, I'll stay away from the vernacular, but we were getting our behinds kicked. And Marshall wanted to know what was going on, sent Bradley over to find out. At the time, by the way, Eisenhower is the one that's in charge of the troops there. It did help. Probably made things a little easier that Eisenhower knew Bradley was a friend of his. Bradley goes there, and at the same time, Eisenhower, knowing that he's going to have to make some changes, and based partly on what Bradley said, partly on other reports and what he saw, he puts Patton in charge, changes corps commanders and or actually army commanders, puts Patton in charge. And Patton gets there and he meets Bradley, spends some time, a few days with Bradley, and he recognizes that he has a dilemma. Because from Patton's point of view, and Patton's a little bit older than Bradley and Eisenhower. As a matter of fact, Bradley had served under Patton briefly in Hawaii, I believe. And Patton's thinking maybe this guy is a spy. He's close to Eisenhower. They're buddies. close to Marshall. I know they go out hunting together. I don't know. Do I really want this guy on my staff? Maybe he's going to be giving bad reports, undercutting me. And Patton decides, maybe it's that old saying where you keep your enemies close to you. He decides to keep Bradley on, and they spend about a month together, just rearranging things and just working on the army, getting the right people into position. And he comes to, it's a very fruitful friendship. And I'm going to call it a friendship, even though you can't think of two personalities that are more different than Patton or Bradley. And Patton does come to respect Bradley, and that probably is very important. That's certainly very important in the course of the war. Patton then leaves to prepare really the American invasion, part of the invasion in Sicily. Bradley heads the troops. Ironically, the Americans did not want to alert the Germans to what was going on, so they don't say that Patton was gone and preparing to, hey, we're going to invade somewhere else. So all of the reports about the American victories in Africa come out in the papers, at least credited to Patton as opposed to Bradley. But Bradley did a really good job, and Patton decided that he wanted him as his corps commander on Sicily. And so they go into Sicily. And again, very difficult, a lot of difficult fighting. They persevere. And after Bradley did such a very good job between Africa and Sicily, that he was chosen to lead the American invasion at D-Day.
With the largest force that anyone commanded.
Yes, by far. And I guess we'd have to look proportionately somehow, because populations and army sizes have increased over the years, but over the centuries, I should say. But it has to rate as one of the biggest commands, at least in terms of sheer number of men, proportionately all the way back to the Roman legions and Alexander and stuff. I can't imagine the amount of organization that it takes. And that's a really good point, Pat, that we're focusing on Bradley here, and certainly he deserves so much credit for everything he did. But we can't forget the men and some women who worked under him and really made things happen. The general can have the greatest ideas in the world, but if the officers who are helping him plan can't follow through, if the NCOs can't motivate their troops, if the privates lose their courage, it's all to naught. So Bradley, and I'm sure Bradley would be the first to tell you that his success really depended largely on his troops.
And we have to just thank all the American people at the time who pulled together, because when you look at it and when you think about it, that was June 1944.
Mm.
In January 1939, America was not prepared. I was shocked to discover that at that point we had 44 tanks, and they were doing tank training by taking trucks and putting a big banner on them that said the word tank. And they were teaching people how to follow a tank, and it wasn't a tank. It is so ridiculous. And our army at that point was number 16 in the world. We were behind, I think, the strangest little countries. From
Yeah, yeah.
1939 to
Oh, yeah.
1944, what the American people did and what happened really at that point is really quite an amazing story.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, and the troops, we're talking about the troops, and I know that it's a joke but it's also, there's truth in it, that the troops were practicing not with guns, but with broomsticks. Yeah, it's very hard to put ourselves back in that time. There was a strong isolationist sentiment in those days, and a lot of people just did not recognize, or maybe they just didn't want to recognize the real danger that other countries, certainly Hitler, posed to world peace and to our very existence. But it is totally remarkable and thank God, that the Americans, and not just the men who go off to war or even just the men who were exempted from service and had to work and worked at home in the factories and farming and that sort of thing. The amount of contributions by women during the war, of course, we all have heard, I would imagine, of Rosie the Riveter, but I would say there probably was not a household in America where a woman did not do more than what was expected, whether it meant going out and working, or maybe picking up the slack for another family whose husband was away and the wife had to work or something. It was just, as you say, just an amazing time of people pulling together, hitching up their pants, to use a cliche that would have been popular at the time, and just doing what had to be done. And thank God we were able to do it. The numbers of tanks, we're laughing about trucks, the numbers of tanks, of ships, of planes, of guns, of everything that was manufactured in that short period of time is nothing short of remarkable.
It is. It's really a miracle. And as we think about D-Day, and I hope that, of course, you've been over there as I have, and
Mm,
when you think of people, the boys mostly at the
mm.
Normandy American Cemetery, it's heartbreaking as part of your research and part of just just being an American when you go overseas. When you go to France, everybody who goes to France really should go to Normandy because the reception that you get there, even today, is so beautiful. The people are so grateful. They are so friendly. And it's a very important place. And of course, you've been there now. So tell us about what it looks like now.
We're looking now on the screen of the beach where that's Omaha Beach, and it's a beautiful. I can't say it's the most beautiful beach in the world, but it's probably rates in the top 10. It's just a wonderful beach. I was out there one morning. I've been privileged to be in France in general, but certainly at Normandy many times. And I've been out there on the beach in the early morning with the sun coming up, all alone except for two people riding horses across the beach for a mile, or what seems like miles. I'm not really sure how long. It's just so wonderful. And if you go, and certainly right now, today, and actually all this week and all this month, pretty much, there'll be a lot of people there. But from the relating to the ceremonies and everything that's going on. But if you go all other times of the year, you'll see a lot of people just throwing out their blankets, soaking in the sun, and just having a wonderful time. Um, it's just amazing to think of what actually happened on that beach. I'm sitting in this photo. Ray Lambert, who, as I had said, as we've been saying, was a medic on D-Day. And this piece of aggregate, which was left over presumably from the Germans building probably a bunker or a pillbox or some other sort of obstruction, was the only place that he could shelter during D-Day, where he literally pulled over a dozen men out of the water and hid them behind this rock, we call it a rock, at under heavy fire, and revived them, treated their wounds if they were wounded. Unfortunately, in a few cases, a few passed away. And there were a few other men with him, and we talk about that actually a lot in the book. And a few years back, the village that this is actually part of decided to honor Ray, and they wanted to honor Ray. Being Ray Lambert, decided that it's all very good and that you want to honor me, but I want you to honor my men too. And so he insisted that the entire battalion of medics be named on the scribe. And it was a phenomenal little ceremony. The entire village turned out and packed into the village hall. And then after some one or two very short speeches in French, they decided to share the village specialty, which is the strongest Calvados that I have ever had. And I would say
Oh,
that I don't know, within 5 minutes. Now, I had been warned on what to expect, by the way, so I was very careful. But I would say within 5 minutes, the entire place was pretty smashed. It was a
Well,
day of celebration. We'll leave it at that.
Calvados will do that to you.
Oh,
Oh
good
yeah,
stuff. Sure.
oh
I
yeah, it
totally
is.
agree.
It's something special. I still remember the first time I had it. It's really special. I want to thank you so much, Jim, for joining me today. This is a special time. I get very emotional at this time of the year when I think of my dad. And it's just really an honor that you've joined me and that we've been able to talk about your great book and to talk about Omar Bradley. And he was definitely a general at war and a great general and a great man. And I think you've done a superb job in honoring him with your book. And so I just want to thank you again. And I keep the Omar Bradley near me all the time because it just reminds me of my dad. So thank you so much for that. And let's just talk here. You have a website that people can go to and discover more, and just mention a few of your other books.
I do. Thank you for all those kind words. I truly appreciate it. And I have to say, Omar Bradley it took me a long time, but it was actually very easy the hard thing was, what do I leave out, really? So most recently, I have a book called Swords of Lightning that I've written with the leader and executive officer of ODA 595. Those are the Green Berets who went into Afghanistan after the Taliban and Osama bin Laden following the 9/11 attacks. And it's called Swords of Lightning. And I hope some readers will pick that up. And I just did a book also with Craig Morgan, the country musician, and as well as many other things. He also was a serviceman. He served in Panama and had some other adventures which we write about. So we're busy.
Okay, then that means I have to have you back so we can talk about more books, okay?
Love to. Anytime.
Okay.
Thanks for having
Okay.
me on.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy to talk to you as always. And again, your book is great and I hope everyone will get it. It's Omar Bradley and he is definitely a great general. So thank you again. Bye-bye now.
Bye now.
Bye. Hi. Well, that was a really great and fun interview for me. As I said, it's a very special time, and I hope that you will both get Jim Felice's book, Omar Bradley, uh, General at War. It is a great book. It is wonderful read, fast paced. He's an well, that's why he is an international best-selling author. He knows how to write a book, and he makes it come alive, and you will enjoy it very much. And if you know anybody, this is also a wonderful book. If you know anyone who's in a VA hospital, I know that every veteran would love to read this book. And that's one of the things at the end of every program, I always ask you to send a book to a child in a hospital, which is a wonderful thing to do. And it's also great if you would just send a book to a veterans hospital. The veterans really love to read, and this book particularly because they all know about Omar Bradley. They would really love it. So if you have a little bit of extra money, all you have to do is go online and just send it to a veterans hospital in your area, and they will appreciate it. And if you have somebody in your family who was in D-Day, you can just make a note of it that it's being sent to a veteran in honor of a veteran or in honor of somebody who you lost on D-Day. So I hope that you will subscribe to my channel. I get very emotional sometimes with the authors that I interview with this book and with many of my books, because these are books that I want you to read and books that I want authors to keep writing, because these stories are so important that we preserve them. And I hope that by doing this program, Joy on Paper Live, I can help promote their books and help them to succeed, because it's very difficult. And if you have an author that you like, please mention it in the comments and I will invite that author. And if you're the first person to recommend that author, I will invite you to join us right here on Joy on Paper Live, so you can share a few minutes with your favorite author. And if you have a book that's changed your life, a book that has really just sort of been the right book at the right moment in your life, I would love to hear about it. And even if it might be a book written 200 years ago, but if a book is something that really has made a difference in your life, I would like to hear about it. I would like to talk about it. So please make a comment below. All you have to do is subscribe and like, share, and comment, and that would be most appreciated, because I'm trying to help authors, and you can help authors too. If you've read a book, if you've bought any book on Amazon, please do a review. That is the kindest thing you can do for an author, is to do a review. Because like here on YouTube, I'm sure you've heard about the algorithms. You have to have a certain number of subscribers, to make it here on YouTube. And the same for authors on Amazon. They need 50 reviews at least. And so if you can help an author and just take a few minutes and write a review, and especially if you buy Jim's book, this is a wonderful book, and buy it and make a comment, and he would appreciate it, and I would appreciate your support. Anyway, thank you very, very much. And please think about D-Day. Think about what we did and how we came together as a nation and how we worked together, and how in 5 years, we built ships, we built everything we needed, and we did it. And we did it because we knew it was important. And I wish that we could all be like that again, that we understand. And now perhaps it is making peace in this world. These wars, they take so much out of you, and you lose so much. And when you think of all the men who died on those beaches in Normandy, maybe you'll pause and think, what can I do to help to make things better in this world? Anyway, thank you, and I hope that you will buy this book and also watch the little promo I do for kids' books, because I love to do books for kids.